Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Deepa Iyer, and I'm excited to welcome you to the first in a series of race talks co-hosted by ChangeLab and 18 Million Rising. Before we get into the discussion, I just wanted to make some quick logistical points. First of all, if you have any issues or questions for us, you can use the chat button to send us a message. If you tweet, please make sure that you use the handles for our speakers, which will appear on the lower third part of their screens when they speak, and also use the hashtag #RaceTalk. And finally, we have about an hour and 15 minutes today, and clearly we can't get to the depth of the questions that we're raising here, but we're going to try. I'm going to play the role of an engaged moderator, which means that I will nicely help our speakers wrap up their points if we're going over time, and also have enough time for some Q&A from all of you. So I want to set a bit of context as we get started. First, this discussion, as I mentioned, is being co-hosted by ChangeLab and 18 Million Rising. ChangeLab convenes people together to look at how demographic changes in the United States are affecting racial justice politics. And ChangeLab has a strategic focus on Asian American communities. I'm glad that Soya Jung and Scott Nakagawa, who are with ChangeLab, are on our discussion today. 18 Million Rising is a network that seeks to promote civic engagement and influence of Asian American Pacific Islander communities through technology and social media. And I want to send out a special shout out to Caden Mack at 18MR for invaluable assistance with this discussion. And I'm thankful to ChangeLab for asking me to moderate this. By way of background on myself, I have worked in the nonprofit sector for about 15 years in Asian American and South Asian American communities, most recently as the director of South Asian Americans Leading Together. Much of that work is actually the basis for a new book that I have coming out in November, which I hope will add to many of these discussions that we're having around the country. Second, today, as many of you know, is the National Day of Actions to End State Violence Against Black Women and Girls. In the spirit of that day, I want to take a moment to say in this space the names of Black women, girls, and transgendered community members, including Maya Hall, Ayanna Stanley Jones, and Rakia Boyd, whose lives have been cut short because of police violence in our country. We'll be talking about the movement for Black lives more during the course of this conversation. So to get us started, the title of this race talk, and we're so glad that so many of you have expressed an interest in being part of it, is called Justice and Equity and the Asian American Angle. Today, we're going to focus more on the justice side of it, with the intent to have another conversation around equity in a deeper way at another time. What prompted this conversation, especially during Asian Pacific American Heritage Month in May, is the often heard statement that Asian Americans are the fastest growing race group in the United States. We wanted to delve into what that actually means. How will Asian American communities address the widening inequalities that exist for many from the standpoint of income, education, healthcare, and basic civil rights? How will Asian Americans build power and influence? And how will we build solidarity in a racial hierarchy that continues to place Black communities at the bottom and invites us to become honorary whites? In order to get into these meta questions, we have to be specific, and that is where our speakers come in. We have joining us from Los Angeles, Karen Wong, the Vice President of Programs and Communications at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, LA. From New York City, we have Ruben An, Program Coordinator of Asian Youth in Action at the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence, or CAAAV. And we've got from Miami, Subhash Kateel, former immigrant rights organizer and host of Let's Talk About It radio show. So first I wanted to learn a little bit more and introduce you to them behind their titles. So Karen, Subhash, and Ruben, I wanted to ask each of you to tell us briefly what or who motivated you to enter the racial justice movement that you're part of. We'll start with you, Karen.
Thank you, Deepa, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's really exciting. So many people are interested in these issues. To your question, Deepa, as to my point of entry into racial justice work, I would just say it's two words. It's the name Vincent Chin. As background, I'm a child of the 1980s, growing up in the Midwest as an Asian American in the Midwest, and I experienced a lot of overt racism, as I think many people who grow up outside of places like New York and LA do, and we know people experience that actually in places like LA and New York as well. But personally, I experienced that tension that we're talking about here today in our talk around how the Black-white racial binary really doesn't do an adequate job of capturing the experience of so many people in this country, particularly more recent immigrant communities. And so I remember growing up in Indiana and being asked questions like, are you Mexican? Because people didn't know where to locate Asians or Asian Americans on the race spectrum. And then for Vincent Chin, for folks who don't know, I think most people calling in probably know, but he was killed in Detroit in the early 1980s by two white auto workers. It happened at the height of the shift from American dominance of the global auto market to Japan. And I was motivated by the fact that Vincent Chin was a Chinese American mistaken for a Japanese American, killed because of anti-Japanese sentiment. And ultimately, the part that drove me into racial justice and civil rights work was that there was no accountability for his killing. It was people had to fight to even have his death recognized as a hate crime, and the white perpetrators who never denied really any guilt over the killing got away with $50,000 of a fine. That was the only consequence to Vincent's death.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks for kind of situating us historically as well. I want to turn to Subhash to tell us a little bit about your point of entry into racial justice, immigrant justice work.
My thank you, Deepa. My informal entry into racial justice, immigrant justice happened in high school. I also grew up in the Midwest, although I'd later moved to New York. I grew up in one of those really segregated towns in a working class city where there was a lot of really deep racial tensions, like Karen just mentioned. I was one of the folks in our high school that helped organize the first Black student union, the first Latino student union. There actually wasn't at the time enough Asians in my school to organize the first Asian union. And one of the things that we had to do was actually stand up to a really racist superintendent when I was a junior. In high school. But then, I feel like my formal entry into the immigrant rights movement really was inspired by a couple of different things. But for one, a lot of the folks that I used to visit in detention centers and immigrant prisons across New Jersey and in New York that did really, really overt things to fight back against their dehumanization every day. And I could list off a litany of names: Sufer Ahmed, Usman Ahid. But a lot of folks that were in immigrant detention and their families really kind of inspired me to really deal with the question of power and politics and imprisonment in really practical and pragmatic ways. And I really just want to hold that up. And just in terms of when I first got politicized, a lot of people say this can become cliche, but I was kind of a knucklehead when I was first in high school. And reading the autobiography of Malcolm X really encouraged me to second guess being a knucklehead, and so I always want to hold that part of it up as well. So.
Great, thank you so much, Subhash. And again, I think historicizing it a little bit. You're also historicizing it a little bit by talking about 9/11 and the post 9/11 moment as well. So lastly, I want to talk to Ruben to hear from you about your point of entry into racial justice organizing spaces. Ruben?
Hello. So for me, I think, yeah, can you hear me? Oh.
Yes, go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
So for me, my point of entry is racial. So my point of entry into racial justice work, I think, family is a really important center point for a lot of people's lives and a lot of people's values. And I grew up living in a class of Korean American immigrants in New York City. Family of operators, salon workers, your usual stereotypical, and for historical reasons, Korean work, and just seeing the exploitation that people in my family experience, and also in which it's systemic, but seeing pushback where their experiences of oppression are treated as personal faults rather than things of broader systemic consequence. And so that was kind of when I started thinking about race. I grew up mostly around with women Um, and then in high school, I got politicized through programs that catered to Asian American youth, bringing it was the first time I was asked about race, and people listened to my thoughts on race, and it began me getting more interested in Asian American history and learning more and pursuing those studies. And so that's kind of my entry. And then in terms of police brutality,
we'll talk about that
the police violence work that we work on.
I'm gonna
it's my work.
That question in just a little bit.
Okay.
But thank you so much. So I think it's great to hear kind of what prompted each of you to be part of the spaces that you're in right now, and to get involved in the movements that you have been involved with and affected. And Ruben, I really appreciate you talking about your how you grew up. I think that that's a really important part of how a lot of folks are getting involved in these movements. So thanks to all three of you for sharing some of that personal information. It helps us to get to know you better. So let's delve in then to some of the substantive parts of the conversation. So the first question that I actually want to ask is to you, Subhash, and I want to ask you to give us some markers around demographics, just to situate us. And so before I come to you, I want to put out some of the statistics that are out there, actually. So Asian Americans, most people I think know this, as I mentioned earlier, are the fastest growing race group in the United States. The community actually grew 46% between 2000 and 2010. And most of this growth actually happened with South Asian American communities, but Filipino, Vietnamese, and Chinese communities also grew rapidly. And so Latino and Asian communities are actually the drivers behind this majority-minority nation that we keep hearing about. As folks likely know, by 2043, America will become a majority-minority nation for the first time in our history. And what that means is that people of color will become the majority population. The demographic changes, though, are already visible. We don't really need to wait until 2043 to see them. For example, just last year, the U.S. Department of Education reported that the number of students of color surpassed those of white students in public schools for the first time. And so we also know that many of our counties and metropolitan areas have also become multiracial jurisdictions. So Subhash, I wanted to ask you about some questions that you think we should be asking ourselves as we think about the changing American racial landscape. Is it going to be this moment of, yes, we've arrived, this kumbaya moment when all of us kind of come together to exercise our power and influence? What and how should Asian Americans be thinking about in terms of our role in the changing American racial landscape?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think it means a lot to me. Living in Miami, I live in one of those cities that's majority minority already, right? And a lot of us that live in places like Detroit and you live in Queens, like you're used to living in majority minority communities and everything that comes with that, right? And the one thing I've noticed living in a majority minority community is that race does indeed transform, and it often ironically transforms in ways that make racism even clearer and sometimes worse and sometimes harder to fight and combat. And I think that's true in the nation as a whole. And so I feel like the thoughts that come through my head as we're talking about this conversation, the growing, changing demographics were felt nowhere more than the last two presidential elections, in which 80 to 90% of people of color, 75% if you're Asian American, but across the board, significant percentages, voted in a way that represented them as people of color, right? Let me just say, almost in a voting bloc. At the same time, within cities like Miami, within cities like New York, you've seen how this idea of a majority-minority kumbaya moment doesn't really happen, whether it's in Ferguson or whether it's in Miami today. And the thought that comes into my head is you take issues that come up across America, like you take an issue like income inequality. As a South Asian, income inequality in the last 2 weeks has showed up in my news cycle in two really prominent ways. One is kind of this gentrification fight in the Lower East Side of New York, involving this Punjabi deli that I used to go to all the time, in which folks are victims of gentrification. And then in the city I live in, Miami, the second largest development project in the country is being built, and the figurehead for that project is a South Asian developer. And this development project would seek to erase probably the most historic and most storied African American neighborhood in Miami. So I think within that, it's, to me, how do we create a situation where the changing demographics lead to us actually changing and eradicating racism and racist institutions versus just kind of this thing that we thought would happen when, actually, I don't think we did. I think TV shows think would happen when the world gets more diverse. I think that's the biggest thing. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up, is, the way Asian Americans enter race, really, the moment that hit home for me the most was, when Jon Stewart and Bill O'Reilly had that conversation about white supremacy. I feel like it was one of those moments where we want an ally to do all the things we do when we talk about race, right? But in a lot of ways, the way Asian Americans entered that conversation was in a way in which we totally had no control over it, right? So we're at a moment when people are protesting across the country around Ferguson. People are talking about race every day in a very good way. Folks are talking about white supremacy. White people are talking about white supremacy. And two well-known white folks are, hashing out racism out over the air. And the way Asian Americans get brought up in that conversation is very specifically a really cliched stereotype that really doesn't have any relation to our day-to-day lives or the folks that we work in if we're working on issues like police brutality or immigration or detention or violence against women, right? And so how do we, as demographics change, really take control of the conversations that involve us, at least have a controlling stake in those conversations? I think that's something that I would like to see us talk about.
Thank you. That's great. And I think that those two markers that you laid out are really important. What's our role in terms of addressing racial inequity, which is going to continue to increase, which won't just naturally go away? And how do we actually work in these, intersectional movements and show up, not just for ourselves, but for other communities as well. So I think that those two markers about the role of Asian Americans as, I would say, kind of disruptors of the racial hierarchy and racist institutions, like you said, and also bridge builders are really important. So I want to just kind of place that there throughout the rest of the conversation. And I also wanted to quickly say before we move on to the next set of questions that if folks are interested in asking questions, and I hope that you are, that you'll go ahead and send them to us over the chat box on your screen so that we can collect them and ask as many questions as possible. All right, so Karen, I wanted to ask you, as a civil rights attorney, as someone who's been working at an institution in Southern California that has really addressed a lot of the types of ways in which Asian Americans experience injustice. If you could talk a little bit about what you see, what are some of the trends, especially as the community's demographics are shifting, what are some of the trends that have been in place for some time, and what do you anticipate to see in terms of the injustices that Asian Americans are likely to face in our country?
Sure, Deepa. I think that this could take up the next hour going over all the various types of issues that our community struggles with, in part because our communities, as probably everyone on this call knows, is just so incredibly diverse, ethnically, racially, ethnically, linguistically, religiously. I mean, the challenges are phenomenal in terms of trying to identify what are the overarching, one or two issues, and there really aren't just one or two. Maybe I can, in terms of going back to kind of the original, the larger framing of this particular hangout, maybe just talk about one kind of overarching thread that we've seen in our work in Los Angeles, I think, for a number of years now. I think it will continue. You had mentioned, Deepa, that Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group in the U.S. I think we earned that title just within the last few years, overtaking Latinos in terms of the rate of growth. And that rate of growth is actually driven heavily in the past and currently by immigration, by foreign-born Asians coming into the country. So as a percentage, for example, I think it surprises a lot of people to learn that Asian Americans are actually more immigrant as a community than Latinos. Latinos are a much larger community numerically, but just as a percentage, proportionally, Asian Americans are well over 60% overall immigrant generation, much higher in certain communities and lower in others. But that's much higher than, I think it's less than 50% of Latinos are immigrants. So I bring that up because one of the ways in which issues of justice manifest for Asian Americans has been around issues of language. When you have so many people who aren't born here, issues of language become a significant thread that runs through almost all of the battles for different types of justice that Asian immigrant communities have engaged in. I also think what's interesting is it's a unique way in which Asian Americans have really contributed to the landscape around civil rights struggles in this country in terms of helping to define civil rights, pushing it sort of beyond that strictly black-white racial paradigm. So a very concrete example is that in the early 1970s, a few years after the 1965 Civil Rights Act was passed, we're just celebrating really the 1964, Civil Rights Act. We've been celebrating the 50th anniversary of that act. A few years after it passed, there was a case brought by Chinese American school children in San Francisco, and they basically alleged discrimination because they were not able to succeed in public school because they couldn't speak English fluently, and they really had no help, no access to the public education system. And that case, Lau versus Nichols, really helped to establish that language-based discrimination was really a proxy for national origin discrimination. It was really another way of discriminating based on race or ethnicity. And Asian Americans have really led the way in terms of defining that as a key civil rights issue. In recent years, you see Asian American activists and advocates and groups really leading on issues of language in places all across the country, in New York, in the Midwest, in the West Coast, everywhere from our access to the polls to be able to vote, our ability to be able to have our day in court, being able to communicate with the judge, access to government benefits. Many in our community are recipients of various benefit programs, and healthcare access. So these are all areas where we've seen Asian Americans really lead the charge in terms of defining language as a justice issue, and by doing that, opening the doors for all immigrants, including African and other immigrants, but really, I think in that way, challenging that sort of black-white paradigm of civil rights laws.
Thanks so much, Karen. And I think that's really important that when we talk about racial justice, that we're not just talking about race. And to your point, that a lot of other issues become proxies. So class, immigration status, language, as you mentioned. And I think that the other point that you mentioned to lift up is that there are greater numbers of language minorities in Asian American populations. We know specifically in certain Southeast Asian and South Asian communities, Korean communities, that they're actually on the rise. And so these issues around language access for benefits, for rights, will certainly become more and more important, it seems, as the country's demographics shift. So thank you for that. And I want to now bring in Ruben again, because I think that one of the ways in which, and Karen, again, you placed us in some historical context, which I appreciate by talking about the Lau versus Nichols case and earlier Vincent Chin, is I think it's important to remember that the Asian American movement is not a recent one. When we look back at, for example, the early 20th century, many Asian immigrants pushed back against restrictive laws that prevented them from naturalizing or owning property. They organized, perhaps not in the ways that we see organizing happening now, but it existed. That pushback and that resistance existed even then. And of course, we know in the struggle for civil rights in this country that we did see the birth of the Asian American studies movement, for example, which actually started out in a very radical place. We also saw the courageous assertion that yellow peril supports Black liberation movements. And so those sorts of points of resistance have been in this community, have been part of Asian American communities' histories for quite some time. And in the 80s and 90s, we saw sort of more infrastructure building, potentially, or more so in the nonprofit sector actually taking shape. And there has been a lot of pushback and pull and push and pull in terms of how effective that has been. But one organization that has had this historical presence is CAAAV, or the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence in New York City. And it has had so particular, CAAAV works on a range of issues, but the one that I wanted you to talk about, Ruben, in particular, is the movement to eliminate police violence and police brutality, which I know is a campaign, a set of, over decades that CAAAV has been involved with. Can you talk a little bit about why it was important for CAAAV to ensure that Asian American voices were present in supporting this movement for ending police brutality?
Sure. So CAAAV actually, just like Karen, our organization, our history started with Vincent Chin, and we started as the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence to respond to sort of like individual acts of hate crimes that were targeting Asian Americans because of like white supremacist racist reasons, and then our analysis of violence actually actually adapted, and so we started organizing on systemic issues affecting communities at large, understanding that violence isn't something that just happens between individuals with no history, but it happens from the state, and it happens to our communities at large, even if we don't always recognize it as violence. And some of the work that we've done with, and it's important for us to participate in this movement, firstly because we've seen how police violence impacts Asian communities. In New York currently, there's a policy called broken windows policing, which enforces low-level violations and criminalizes people, particularly people who are low-income, people of color, and also queer and trans communities. And it was started in the 90s, and one of the products of that was a lot of police killings with impunity in New York City. And so we organized around the case of a young Chinese American boy named Yongxin Huang, who was killed, and the officer, Isaac Mizrahi, was never held accountable. And since then, we've participated also by participating in coalitions like Communities United for Police Reform to stop and reform, stop and frisk, People's Justice, Coalition Against Police Brutality in the early 2000s, after Amadou Diallo was killed. And yeah, this work is important for us, first off, to include our narrative of how we're impacted by police violence, but also because of our root understanding that violence is systemic. And so police being able to kill with impunity, and it disproportionately impacting communities of color, particularly Black communities, also women and trans folks. If we're truly committed to fighting violence, like that's the violence that we have to fight, and we have to see the broader. And it's important for us to see the broader picture of what violence truly is. Economic exploitation, police brutality, gentrification.
Great. Thank you so much, Ruben. And we're going to come back to you in a bit because we also want to delve into the recent work that CAAAV has been doing in terms of the movement for Black Lives in particular. So it was really important, though, for us to get that history and how you all and other Asian American organizations. I know, for example, Daisy's Rising Up and Moving is another organization in New York City that's been actually part of the movement to end police brutality as well. So it's really important to get that history. I also wanted to pick up on something that you said that I think is really important, which is how individual hate violence or individual discrimination is really also connected to systemic inequality and systemic issues. Obviously, we have, I think, all become more and more aware of this when we hear about the ways in which especially Black neighborhoods have been abandoned and neglected, and kind of the systemic inequities that lead to the situations that we have been seeing with police brutality. But it's also true in Asian American communities as well. And I was wondering, Subhash, if you could tie that up for us in terms of the ways in which we are seeing systemic racism or systemic discrimination affect Asian American communities, perhaps specifically drawing upon your work as an immigrant rights organizer and working kind of in the detention deportation system. If you could pull together some of those threads for us.
Sure. So, I mean, for one, the example I want to bring up about the systemic and individual actually goes to in the African American community, and in the current context, what made Baltimore different from Ferguson, right? There's a lot of things that we could talk about, right? But one thing that kind of informed my work from early on, and I think this is the way I'd like to think about the individual versus the systemic, or the individual and the systemic, is, you know, in Baltimore, the story that isn't talked about a lot is that there was a woman whose son was killed by police violence who made a decision at some point in time that she was not going to stand with the prosecutor that they had in Baltimore, and made it her complete drive to get rid of that prosecutor and replace that prosecutor with someone that would respond to police killings in Baltimore. And you know, in addition to the uprisings that happened in Baltimore, that was a key difference, is the fact that you had these 6 officers that were actually charged versus, you know, whatever the hell you had happen in Ferguson. And that ties me back to the work that I started doing with immigrant rights and with immigration, is that one of the things that we started seeing is that in a lot of Asian American communities, I don't want to say all, I don't want to paint with broad brushstrokes, but when we talk about some of the very systemic problems that we're facing, that at the time that I started organizing, the existing leadership did not want to talk about those problems in a way in which we actually addressed them. What I mean by the leadership is, I mean the self-designated leaders of our community that, you know, I don't want to talk about too disparagingly, because often they're the folks that, you know, welcome folks when they came into the community, helped them get their first job, things like that. But when it came to some of the core issues of people getting beaten up by the police, or people getting denied, you know, welfare benefits because of translation problems, you know, detention, deportation, they were often not set up to respond to these issues, right? And then we found, you know, with my work at the time, right during 9/11, I was working with Paces Rising Up and Moving, and we were doing a lot of the visitation to the detention centers in New Jersey and in New York, where people were detained in the mass roundups. And the thing that I noticed at the time, and you know, one of the folks I mentioned is Usman Nahid, is that the individuals that are directly affected by the detention deportation process, at a time when a lot of our community leaders did not want to speak up because they didn't want the community to be unfairly targeted, they didn't want, you know, the community to be tarnished. Sometimes the only folks that would speak up in those circumstances really were folks who had husbands and wives or loved ones that were directly in detention. And that was kind of a key breakthrough moment for me about how the individual affects the systemic. And I think currently, I just think about that in terms of police brutality work, and in terms of anti-war work, and in terms of gentrification work, and how our abilities as a community to tell our stories are kind of the linchpin of what makes our movement successful and unsuccessful. And one of the biggest challenges, as I said in the beginning, is our basic inability of the folks that are most directly affected in our community to tell our stories and own our stories. And so I think that's kind of, the one thing that I leave with.
Thank you. And I think that as we kind of keep going through this conversation, that it would be really great to hear about how you think that should happen. You know, what is it as Asian Americans continue to become more engaged? How should we be making sure that the voices of those you talked about are centralized and prioritized and speak? So we kind of went through sort of an understanding of the demographic changes and what Asian Americans should be thinking about. We talked a little bit about the trends that we're going to see when it comes to individual discrimination and rights-based discrimination. We talked about systemic discrimination, and now I want to actually talk about the role of solidarity building. You know, another kind of common refrain that we often hear about the majority-minority or multiracial future that we're building is that it will be a moment for people of color, because we have numbers, that we will be working in solidarity with each other kind of naturally. And I think that we all know that this is not true, that this is false, it's a red herring, that there is good work happening, but we have a lot of work to do still in order to build these bridges and understanding, so that our work becomes not just transactional, but can actually become more transformative when we're talking about our communities. So I wanted to specifically ask each of you to specifically focus in on an issue where you think that there is potential for multiracial solidarity, and also bring up for us the honest challenges that exist, the fissures that might be emerging. So I want to start with talking about the movement for Black Lives with Ruben and Subhash first, and then I want to go to you, Karen, to talk a little bit about affirmative action. So Ruben, why don't we start with you? Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges as well as the possibilities when it comes to organizing around the movement for Black Lives, especially in New York City, especially now, where we're also seeing sort of the indictment of Officer Peter Liang in the death of Akai Gurley, and use that as your frame.
Sure. And then I'm going to also refer to what Karen and Subhash had mentioned. Karen about language justice being an issue in our communities, and then Subhash about how it's the individuals who are directly impacted or connected to those directly impacted who oftentimes do the labor and the work of the movements. And I think those are kind of like where some key challenges are in terms of building solidarity, is that in the instance of Akai Gurley, who was killed by Chinese police officer Peter Liang, our communities are, we can say our communities, particularly the Chinese community in New York City, is directly impacted, but not necessarily in the sense of being affected by oppression, but being complicit and perpetuating it. And so a challenge has been not being directly impacted, and also having to force people to sort of like recognize our complicity. It's hard to do that authentic, like that storytelling and lifting up the individual stories in our communities becomes that much harder, because it's not a sympathetic story to tell. But I do think that the reason why it's important to do this work, and we should strive for solidarity, not necessarily like claiming that we're doing solidarity work, but striving for it, is that I do think police violence and racial justice is a system. We have to see the bigger picture, and I think that our communities, even as we're complicit, we are the messengers who have unique access to people in our communities, whether it's our families, whether it's whether it's immigrants. And so I do think that we do have access to shedding light in a way that other communities might not have access to our communities. The challenge with that is like how do we do that while still directing attention to the Black lives and the Black leadership that's so central, and understanding that in a way our solidarity work is important, but the reason why we're talking about it in the first place is because of the labor of people in people fighting, and I think language justice is an issue because particularly when we're reaching out to limited English proficient folks, not having ethnic media that's sympathetic, and understanding that the channels that limited English proficient, like generally elderly immigrants, like what kind of like narratives they have access to, if the channels that they're accessing aren't sympathetic, and language justice means that sometimes our communities are separated in terms of the stories that we're able to tell and the complicated narratives that we're able to move around. It's been hard, but we've been fighting and pushing to make sure that Akai Gurley's family, their narratives are included in ethnic media by holding press conferences, by holding direct actions, so that people don't just see one side, but they also see another.
I want to make sure that folks know that they should check out the CAAAV website for more information about the Akai Gurley trial, the Peter Liang indictment, and even some actions that people can take, because CAAAV has very solidly, as you said, come out to take a position that Asian American communities need to be supporting Akai Gurley's family in terms of what's been going on in New York City and with the Black Lives Matter movement in its entirety. So Subhash, staying with Black Lives Matter, as we've heard, and I think all of us know, Asian Americans have come out in support, in solidarity, right? But what do we do kind of more than holding signs? What do we do more than having conversations like this in order to express and actually build out authentic solidarity? How do we do it, both within our own communities, but also in terms of looking at how we build across communities as well?
Yeah, and I'm not sure how what I'm going to say is going to show up, because I feel like I've been thinking about this for a good 12 years, and I feel like I've changed a lot over the past 12 years. But to start off with yet another story, when I was doing immigrant rights organizing for an organization that helped start called Families for Freedom, there was a letter we received from a group of hunger strikers in rural Louisiana who was detained in a county jail that was far, far, far away from any major city. And the letter came from folks that were Muslim, Sikh, Rastafari, and Christian, folks from Jamaica, India, Lebanon, and a few other countries I can't even remember at the time. And the letter was to let us know that there was a hunger strike going on because the Muslims, the Sikhs, and the Rastas were having their hair forcibly shaved. People were being put in solitary confinement. People were being beat up. People were being force-fed diets that were contrary to the religion, whether it was vegetarians being fed meat, folks being fed pork. And there was a relatively long and hard hunger strike amongst folks that in the detention system, a lot of people may or may not know this, both in the immigrant prison system, the prison system, and the detention system, there's a lot that thrives off of creating, differences and distinctions and divisions between different ethnic groups, between different racial groups, right? But this was a letter that came to us of folks on a hunger strike, and it wasn't the first, it wasn't the last. It was kind of the first one that really taught me about solidarity and to question it, because I think that some of the conversations on solidarity, and I don't think it's anyone on this call, but some of the conversations on solidarity have talked about having the hard conversations with our community, which I think is completely good and completely fine, right? But I think that it has to go a step above that, and I think when we talk about, and this is the reason why we have to talk about centralizing the voices of directly affected people, not because it's easy, it's actually some of the hardest work to do, right? But because those conversations, even though they're hard, really kind of help highlight what's wrong with the system in a way in which our communities can have a real understanding of how to fix it, and how racism and discrimination and inequality show up differently in our communities. And the examples that come to my head once again during Ferguson, whenever there's uprisings in the African American community, I feels like cameras almost instinctively and reflexively want to go to the Asian business owners for them to say something completely disparaging about black folks, right? In the middle of an uprising, and it happened in the LA riots. And for a brief period of time in Ferguson, community members, maybe not so brief, but a lot of the South Asian and Asian business owners weren't really all that happy to be on camera and disparage the folks in the community, the folks in the neighborhoods that they served, right? Even though there was very real tensions. And some of that could be that, some of it could be for financial reasons or whatever, but, in my honest opinion, I think that something's happened to Asian American businesses that hasn't been talked about in the past 10 years since 9/11. And, South Asian businesses, Asian American businesses have also been targeted by different forms of law enforcement in the past 10 years. We don't talk about that a lot, and our communities don't talk about that a lot. And because we don't talk about that a lot of folks don't even get why South Asian businesses or Asian businesses may respond differently to law enforcement than they did 10 years ago. The case of the biker gang this past week reminded me that at a time when biker organizations were bringing a disproportionate amount of meth into northern Georgia, the prosecutors in northern Georgia decided to launch a raid against virtually every Indian business owner in Rome, Georgia, about 10 years ago in this operation called Operation Meth Merchant, in which dozens of people were arrested, dozens of folks that I would call uncle and auntie were deported. That there was, 5 years before that, this operation called Operation Fleeced America that went after almost exclusively Asian American business owners who were applying for SBA loans and detained, arrested, put in federal prison, and deported tons of folks. So I'm saying that for a reason. The stories about those two operations aren't centralized in our community, even though when you look at them, these were operations that almost exclusively targeted our community, right? And should color the way our communities view law enforcement as a whole, right? And they don't for a bunch of different reasons. And I think that we need to start talking to our community members in a way in which we're centralizing the voices of directly affected people, centralizing the way that racism shows up in a community distinctly, but then in a turn, talk about fighting for our communities in a way where we encourage folks to never just stop there, right? I think that often when we get our communities as a whole to fight against injustice, and this isn't all communities, all of our communities, but when we get our communities to fight injustice, the next step is making sure that we don't just stop at our communities and that we fight to address the root causes of racial violence, of economic violence in this country. I could probably go on for longer, but But I think that those are the things that kind of stick out in my head around the moment we're in.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you, Ruben and Subhash. I think that there are so many different ways in which I think folks are thinking about the movement for Black Lives beyond Asian American solidarity. Around, for example, as you said, Subhash, looking at how police violence has affected Asian American communities, obviously not in similar ways, not in proportional ways at all as to African American communities, but recognizing that there are strands of law enforcement violence that affect community members, businesses, and the like. And I think that's important to raise up. And also looking at some of the fissures or tension points. So, to Ruben's point around what's happening in New York City with the indictment of a Chinese American police officer, with, as you said, Subhash, the reflexive pointing of cameras at Asian American business owners, and looking at imagined or reimagined tensions between communities and merchants. Maybe that's an opening for some conversations about what an equitable economic structure actually looks like in a neighborhood, right? And so if those sorts of conversations can be jump-started, perhaps we can move further along. So I know we can do more on Black Lives Matter and Ferguson and Baltimore, and hopefully some questions will come in along that vein. And if you want to, you can just write a question into your chat box and we'll get to it. But I want to turn to you, Karen, to talk about affirmative action in particular, because that has again been an area, a site of a lot of tension between communities of color, where Asian Americans have been sort of used as a wedge, but it's also perhaps a potential for opportunity when it comes to solidarity building. So I'll turn it over to you to talk about that, and I know California has been really the site of so much of this over the past few years.
Yeah, thank you, Deepa. Yeah, I mean, there's so much we could talk about in terms of the issue of affirmative action. I'll try to keep my comments, somewhat narrow, because I know folks might have questions, and I think we're here partially to hear from everyone on the Hangout and address your questions. But just so we're on the same page, in terms of affirmative action, what we're talking about here, especially around the points of fissure, as Deepa's mentioned, between our communities, Asian Americans, and other communities of color, and quite honestly, also also quite honestly, within our community itself, is that affirmative action is what people don't understand a lot of times, especially within our community, is that it's not a quota program. What it is it's about race being one of many factors that is taken into consideration in the education context in what we call a holistic admissions process. Many universities, most universities, at least the ones that are points of contention, now use that type of admissions process. And legally, under the U.S. Supreme Court's rulings, you can't use race as a sole factor, but it can be one of multiple factors that's considered. So in terms of affirmative action, as Deepa mentioned, it has really been an issue. I think that's actually, it's a fissure that's not new. It's been out there for a number of years. What's changed, I think, fairly recently is it being pushed quite openly into the public, and this particular tension within our community. If folks have been paying attention to the news, just within the past week, for example, there was a fairly high-profile action on the behalf of opponents of affirmative action within the Asian American community, bringing a federal civil rights complaint. They actually filed 2 complaints, I believe, with the Department of Justice and Department of Education against Harvard University. Harvard has also been sued in federal court along with UNC, North Carolina, on the same issue. And then what Deepa mentioned is in California, affirmative action in education has actually been banned for close to 20 years through the ballot initiative process here. But there have been efforts over those last 2 decades to try and bring back affirmative action in various ways, the most recent effort being last year. And in both of those cases, the reason I raised those, and I think that Deepa and I talked about wanting to bring this up in this particular Hangout context, is that in both cases, what we're seeing is this split within our community, a vocal minority, and I want to emphasize it's a minority of members of our community have spoken out against race-conscious programs like affirmative action programs, and they're getting a lot of traction because the media and the white power structure loves nothing better than seeing us, people of color, fight each other, because then we don't fight the larger powers. So that has been something that has been, I think, actually purposely put forward. I think Asian Americans are being encouraged to raise these voices on the other side of affirmative action. The split that we talk about is very important. I think that those of us who support affirmative action have actually been trying to push the split into the open, because we want to show that while maybe we can't show universal alignment in our community around things like affirmative action, it's important to show that there's a split, that the voices who are filing these complaints and lawsuits do not represent all Asian Americans. In fact, if you look at polling, even within the last couple of years, this is public opinion polling, and it includes public opinion polling in Asian languages, you find over and over again that Asian Americans of all different backgrounds support affirmative action programs, including in education, by significant margins. 60 to 70% of our community has indicated support, and this has been played out over multiple polls, so it's not like a one-time thing in one poll. So what the tension shows, I think, from where I sit in terms of the civil rights work that we do, for example, is really the danger when there's a lack of historical knowledge, as well as an understanding of the current context of issues like affirmative action. So Asian Americans who are organizing against things like affirmative action really don't see how we as a community have benefited. Many of our privileges are directly or indirectly related to doors that affirmative action programs have opened over the last 30 or 40 years and continue to open. There are actually many within our communities, because it's so diverse, many Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who benefit from these race-conscious programs. I think in terms of what Deepa mentioned around, and I'm sorry, and the other thing I did want to point out is, in addition to the polling, one thing I encourage folks to look at if you're interested in this and you haven't heard about it is when we heard about the Harvard complaint being filed last week, we actually were able to organize a response, not directly just to that complaint, but the fact that affirmative action has been under attack over the last few years, and Asian Americans have been seen as leading that charge. We wanted to show on our side that Asian Americans, actually quite a few of us, would stand up for affirmative action programs. And so it was actually really amazing. We put out an open letter, actually taking a page from CAAAV, which does amazing work in New York, and your open letter around supporting Akai Burley's family. We were able to get, I think it's 135 and counting Asian American and Pacific Islander groups around the country in less than 36 hours to sign on and saying, you know what, we are not those people that are opposing affirmative action and race consciousness. We stand for affirmative action programs. And I think there were actually well over 500 individuals who also signed on to it, Asian Americans. And so that's actually, I think the website is asianamericancivilrights.org. You can see the open letter, the signatories. You can still sign on. There are a lot of resources on that page. And it wasn't just Advancing Justice that worked on that, but civil rights activists from around the country talked about it, particularly in California. I wanted to maybe just end this part by saying one thing. It gets to Deepa's point about the opportunities. One thing I think is interesting about this Fisher point around affirmative action is the interesting moment that I think it presents for us as Asian Americans. If there is one issue that seems to galvanize people in our community across ethnicity, across language, across generation, across class, it's education. It's education as a way forward for new immigrants, for poor families, for poor communities. And at the same time, we're in a country that's facing a huge public education crisis from K through 12 all the way through public higher education. In places like California and in many states, there's been a massive public disinvestment in public higher education, meaning money for our public colleges and universities is dramatically diminished, even though the population is growing, the number of young people trying to go to college is growing. And Asian Americans really, quite honestly, have an opportunity. We're kind of at a fork in the road where we could leverage our interest in this issue and the influences that we do have, the privileges that we do have, to fight for essentially a structural equity issue, fighting for public education, and in a way that benefits not just us as individuals, and not even just our communities, but people of color and poor people more generally. And it remains to be seen whether this is an opportunity that we as a community can seize. In California, we are trying to do this because there is this very great fissure around affirmative action in the state of California. In LA, for example, we're working, my organization is working with a multiracial coalition, including Latinos, African Americans, Southeast Asians, and Pacific Islanders, trying to push this issue of not only do we need to defend affirmative action, but we also need to look at what's going on in larger public education system and fight for our seats in the public colleges and for access for the most disadvantaged in our communities.
Thanks, Karen. And I know it's not easy to talk about and summarize affirmative action in 4 minutes, but somehow you did do that, and you gave us the California perspective as well, so I appreciate that.
I can talk really fast, so.
We're gonna, we have a lot of folks on Twitter tweeting using the hashtag #RaceTalk. We appreciate that. You can send us questions there. You can send us questions using your chat box. I'm going to pause right now to ask a couple of the questions that we have coming in. And one of the questions that's come in actually is around workers, right? And so we have been seeing, especially in New York recently, the story in the New York Times. It's a story that a lot of organizations have known for quite some time about the exploitation in the nail salon industry. And it's important to note that many of the nail salons in New York City are owned by Asians, and they employ immigrant workers, right? And the type of worker exploitation that many workers have endured, whether it is in terms of not getting adequate pay, whether it is in terms of the really devastating health conditions that they are exposed to, is something that organizations have been talking about for quite some time. Organizations like Adhikar, for example, in New York City, and others. We know that Nepali, Vietnamese, Korean, Tibetan nail salon workers, these are the primary nail salon workers in New York City, Asians. So the question that we have is around how can we have conversations with the business owners to actually live up to the standards of the law, and to help them understand that their customers, their patrons, and their workers are having difficulty if they don't live up to the law. And so I think this is about those hard conversations that Subhash alluded to earlier as well. So I was wondering, Karen, if you want to start with that and tell us a little bit about some ways that we should be thinking about this, and then invite either Ruben or Subhash if you want to jump in.
Thanks, and I feel bad. I know I just spoke for a long time, so I'll try to keep this really short. I guess I'll make 2 points. One is that I think what's interesting about the nail salon example that was highlighted in New York, and the articles were very much about New York City, but clearly the issues there play out across the country. I think New York may be more Korean, and in California, for example, it's heavily Vietnamese dominated, both on the worker and owner end. But I guess 2 points I would want to make. One is I think one thing we haven't raised here, but it's more about sort of internal to the Asian American community, is I think examples like the nail salon industry really show tensions around class within our community, because you have people in our community that often own businesses that are often employing people from within the same community. And that leads to my second point, which I actually did raise earlier, which is I think language is a really key component of this issue of how do we ensure better understanding of what the laws are that protect the workers, of the health and safety issues. In California, I know there's been some similar struggles to what's been described in the New York Times article. Our partner organization in San Francisco, Advancing Justice, ALC, Asian Law Caucus, has actually done a great deal of work in this area, but language has been a real struggle because you have immigrant business owners who don't necessarily understand, sometimes fairly complex rules around health and safety as well as around labor. Definitely there is explicit, deliberate exploitation going on, and I am not trying to excuse that at all. But I also think that one of the challenges with the complexities of the various laws we have, including in labor and health and safety, is that when things aren't in a language that's understandable for people for whom English is not their first language, it can be a real struggle to really understand what exactly is expected, when it's expected, what the penalties are. And it's been a struggle in places like California to get information to workers and owners in languages that they understand in a timely way, and to be able to respond to questions and to do compliance or investigation interviews in language. And those are significant struggles even in states with such large populations of immigrants that you would think it would just be accepted, that you'd have to do it in Korean in New York and in Vietnamese in California, and yet that's not the case.
And your point is really well taken. I think that some of the kind of the remedies that you pointed out have actually been at least put in place on paper by Mayor Bill de Blasio just recently, who signed into place, I think just a few days ago, some regulations, some standards that need to be met by nail salon business owners, and many of that actually includes in language, Asian language materials, for example, and trainings. And so, again, I just want to lift up the work of the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum and groups like Adhikar, who have really been at the forefront of making sure that these issues around at least the nail salon industry are lifted up to the level of advocates and policymakers. So a second question that's come up, and I'm going to turn to Subhash and Ruben on this. Start with you, Subhash, and then go to you, Ruben, for the answers, is really around what both of you talked about, the importance of centralizing the experiences, the voices, the power of folks who are most affected, most directly affected. And this is something that we hear often, right? And I think the question is the how. Have you seen some best practices, some models of whether it's storytelling, as you said, Subhash, or organizing, as you talked about, Ruben, that can really help us understand what you mean when you say that, and put down the challenge for Asian American organizations, right, and Asian American activists to take up. If we're really serious about racial justice movement building in this country, how do we do this? So I want to start with you, Subhash, and then when I get to you, Ruben, really would love to hear about the work that you are doing with young folks at CAAAV as well. Subhash? You're muted, Subhash. So Subhash is muted. So as he's, okay, there you go.
Yeah, I think I should break every conceivable stereotype of South Asians and computers. So just first off, in terms of a resource, organizations like Families for Freedom that I was once a director of, but now has went through several generations of leadership of folks that were former members of the organization, and organizations like Drum and organizations like CAAAV have been doing this for a long time. So there's some very organizational, there's very specific organizational models to follow. But I think there's a few basic ones. One is if you're an organization doing social justice, that talks about doing community organizing, make sure you're hiring organizers, right, that are doing the job of doing the hardest edge organizing possible. Number two, as a general rule, directly impacted folks should never just be brought in when you have a press conference and when you need a story to cry on. And this goes back to the why, and goes back to the Baltimore story, the difference between Baltimore and Ferguson about why directly affected. As a community organizer that was doing detention work, I actually did not care about the law or about legal anything until I met members of my organization that had to fight to get out of the detention without lawyers, right? Similarly, the reason directly affected people are important to this discussion isn't because the stories are rich, it's because their knowledge of the system is rich, right? And I think we have to make that paradigm shift of folks from victims and clients to folks that inform our conversation and folks that educate us, right? Whether it's how to survive the detention system, whether it's how to build a know your rights training that resonates, whether it's even helping us understand how the law actually works in our communities or doesn't work. I think we have to just change those notions on our head and not accept shortcuts. I can go on forever, but I think as a basic rule, right, is thinking of how we transform folks in our communities, the way we view them as victims to survivors to teachers, right? And I think once we kind of make that link, I think things can get better. And then the last thing I'll always say over and over again is, as organizations, as a community, as people that do justice work, we should never rely just on people's stories. And if we're doing that, then we're doing something wrong. And that's a hard process. It's a laborious process. It's a painstaking process, but it's a process that produces the most justice.
Thank you, Subhash. I think that was really, simple in its and how profound it was. From victims to teachers, from victims to survivors, so from victims and clients the teachers and survivors. So thank you for kind of framing that. Ruben, I saw you nodding a lot when Subhash was speaking, which leads me to believe that you agree with much of what he said. Can you also tell us a little bit about the how? I think we get the why, but what are some of the best practices that you all use? I know that you work very closely with young folks in New York City, so maybe you could kind of use that as some of your examples.
Yeah, I think what helps is to yeah, there's been a lot of ways like recently in New York City that the Asian community has been torn around police violence, whether it's like the Kai Gurley case or whether it was the case of officers who were the officers who were killed in December, one of whom was Chinese, and that was used by the NYPD and the police unions to repress and kind of villainize a lot of the police protests. And so at our youth meetings, we just created space to have like conversations around how people were feeling, and people were bringing in that this is what their families are saying, that this is kind of the mixed responses that are kind of like and divisions that are like existing in the communities. But what we always come back to is like as we have these conversations and allow people to just share like what's on their mind, what's like the first thing on their mind, to have an understanding of what our common value and what our common vision is. And I think if you say that you're committed to doing racial justice work and you believe in a racial justice that's universal and benefits all people, we were also kind of like redirecting the conversation to based on our values, like what we feel like is the position that we want to take, recognizing that like it can be like we can there can be a lot of emotions happening at once, like rationally and emotionally, and I think that's important for not even just talking within organizations, but across the board, trying to find what those common values are, and just trying to stretch the conversation to build more support for people who are directly impacted, even if you aren't directly impacted. And so if with Kai Gurley and the pushback from the Asian communities, one of the things that we always go back to is that our communities want to grow, our communities want to thrive, and part of the bigger picture of policing is not is the fact that systemically we're seeing divestment from our neighborhoods in terms of healthcare services. I know mental health is like an important issue in Asian communities. Education, education, housing, and so I'm trying to find the connections. Great.
Thanks. And I think, Ruben, you pointed out how these issues are actually interlinked and interwoven. And thank you for kind of playing that out. And I know that a lot of the youth that you all work with are focused on making the connections between these various issues as well, and in terms of how they live in New York City. So we're almost at the end of time. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to use that time to get some closing thoughts from our speakers. We've had a really far-ranging conversation about the justice end of the conversation today, right? So I started off talking about putting out there that Asian Americans in this changing racial landscape have to be disruptors of the racial hierarchy in this country, of white supremacist, racist systems and institutions, and also be bridge builders. And I think all three of you have talked a lot about how we have done that, both historically as well as today. Talking about some of the trends when it comes to individual discrimination, how we're changing the landscape of what civil rights looks like, and also making the links in terms of the systemic racism that affects our communities and connects us to other communities of color. And in that vein, we talked about solidarity and what it can look like in terms of movement building, what it can look like in terms of challenges, and laid open some of the internal challenges that we have within our communities as well as those with other communities of color. So in that vein, I wanted to ask each of you to actually kind of leave us with a call to action. And I wanted you to target your call to action to young people. I'm not saying that any of us are not young, but I really think that there is great momentum happening among young Asian Americans all around the country. And I know that a lot of them are listening in and watching us. So what would be your call to action as you think about the communities and neighborhoods that they're going to inherit and make and shape? What would your call to action be for them? So let's start with, why don't we start with Karen, and then Ruben, and with Subhash. Karen.
Sure. Well, I'll go back, I think, and maybe just underscore a point I tried to make earlier, which is that in terms of the call to action, you know, I think Asian Americans have a really unique opportunity at this moment in time to really advance kind of equity and justice for, you know, all communities of color. And, you know, I think we, you know, Ruben and Subhash have talked about it in the Black Lives Matters context and in the affirmative action context. You know, I really do think that we have an opportunity around issues of affirmative action and access to public education as Asian Americans to really make a difference. And we're sort of at this kind of crucial moment in time where we could tip either way. And I think that's why the tension between our community being out in the open is actually a good thing. I think the challenge now is for us to tip that tension in the direction of those of us who have a more holistic, progressive view of what we as Asian Americans should stand for. And I did actually, even before asked us to speak to the youth or younger people, and I definitely am not, because I outed myself as being a child of the 80s early on. But I think some of the most compelling voices just in this fight around education access and affirmative action have been the younger members of our community. I don't know if any of them are on the call, but there is a young man in California, 18 Million Rising, has posted his essay. Jason Fong from California, a high school student who wrote a beautifully compelling essay around, you know, why he as a high school student really supports affirmative action. You know, he knows the challenges for him ahead, but he wrote just a beautiful essay about why that's important to someone like him as an Asian American. And just, I think in response to the complaint against Harvard, one of the most powerful pieces I read was from a current Harvard student, Bernadette Lim. If you look online on the Asian American Civil Rights site, you'll see there's a link to a piece that she wrote as a current Asian American student at Harvard, really articulating really well this issue of why Asian Americans shouldn't be the wedge. So I just really want to give a shout out to the young people in our community who are actually already leading the way.
That's great. Thank you for those examples as well. Ruben, what's your call to action in terms of young people in this moment? Keep it to about a minute.
Okay. So I guess my call to action is just to, you know, like speak out in whatever ways that you can. And, you know, when the Peter Liang stuff was happening, people, you know, were saying that, oh, like Asians are being targeted because they're quiet and we don't take action. And my response to that is, I think when communities of color, when we're united, like, you know, I think our solidarity and unity speaks volumes, and speaks louder than just our community can say ourselves. So whether it's attending demonstrations or having discussions with your family and friends, and or you know, taking a stand in school when maybe not everyone agrees with you. Those are all important. And even like sharing on social media, I didn't realize, but there's a lot of tensions within my family. But then I was like finding that, like, you know, things, information I was sharing, you know, voices of directly impacted people were actually being read by people who, you know, I would get into fights about, and, you know, they would acknowledge that, you know, their views were shifting. And so I think, you know, recognize that your voice is power, and, you know, even when the backlash might not reflect that, like, you know, keep on speaking up.
That's great. That's really helpful. Thank you. Subhash, what's your 1 minute call to action for young people?
1 minute. Well, the first thing I say to young people is don't let anyone ever tell you that music of the 80s was better. It just wasn't. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is, you know, really quickly, I think something I always want to mention is that, you know, when I talk to a lot of my uncles and aunties over here, I think I underestimated how little illusions they had about, like, the racist institutions in America and the things they wouldn't say out loud about the things they went through in this country, the things they continue to go through in this country. So I think the first thing is to don't assume that the conversations, that they haven't had those conversations as well, which brings me to my last thing about I I want to push back, not against anything that anyone else has said, but against this idea that what we need is hard conversations. We need hard conversations, but we've had those hard conversations at our dinner tables. If we don't follow them up with calls for hard action that actually tackles the system in a way in which we're all kind of taken out of the worst parts of that system, all of us, then those hard conversations are just conversations, right? That a lot of us have in our dinner table. So that's the one thing. It's just in a cheesy way, you know, like move beyond hard conversations into hard action. And if we don't have power, really figure out ways to get power and get freedom. That's it.
That's great. I really feel like all three of you gave us very specific ways to take action. And like you said, Subhash, move beyond the conversations into actions. And this has been a conversation, and we'll hopefully have some more of these conversations depending on kind of the input that we hear from folks. So if you enjoyed this conversation, or if you feel that we didn't connect on issues that we should have, please feel free to reach out to us via ChangeLab or 18 Million Rising. I want to end by just naming a couple of resources that folks might be interested in along the justice side of this issue that we talked about. For organizations that are working at the national level, we can go to a website called nkappaonline.org and find a list of about 30 national Asian American organizations, including the one that Karen's with, that provide resources and information. Second is, if you're interested in local, more grassroots movement building groups, check out Seeding Change, where groups like CAAAV and others, Daisies Rising Up and Moving and others around the country, are coming together to really build an ethos and a practice of grassroots movement building in Asian American communities. Also, the www.asianamericancivilrights.org is the website that Karen's mentioned a few times if your interest specifically is in affirmative action and those issues. In addition, you know, bloggers like Jen at Reappropriate, Angry Asian Man, Aerogram, you know, and of course the folks here are all resources for people, as well as Race Files, which is a blog that ChangeLab curates. So I hope that folks will really connect with those resources, and more importantly, that some of this conversation has sparked actions that you might be wanting to take individually or collectively in your own communities. So thank you again to Karen Wong, to Ruben An, to Subhash Kateel for spending so much time talking about these issues. Also wanted to thank 18 Million Rising and Caden Mack for the tech assistance on their end, and of course to ChangeLab as well for co-hosting this important conversation. And hopefully we'll see you again at another time to explore other issues that we didn't get to. So thank you, good night, and see you all very soon.